Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today I am in a fantastic private garage space, and it's full of Ford performance cars and also a lot of Shelbys, Cobras, a GT350. You're gonna see more of it in a few minutes, but our host today is my good buddy, Kip Cyprus. Kip, thanks for having us in.
I always enjoy it when you're here.
And with Kip is a guy who's sort of, you could say that he's part of American racing royalty. If you've ever heard of Dan Gurney, and I'm sure you have, and All-American Racers, well, Dan was a very special person and means a lot to motorsport in general, and particularly to American motorsport. Justin Gurney, thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me, Maurice. Really great to be here.
I don't know where to start, guys, but Kip, why don't we start with why all these cars are in the garage today?
Well, just recently we had about 50 Ford GTs here, and we had them all out in the atrium area. So in here we've got nothing but Shelbys and GT40s and Ford GTs, and Justin was kind enough to put a couple cars on loan, and they're here today, and that's what we got going.
Justin, a lot of these cars have really special significance given your family background and given what your father did, not just in racing, but also at All-American Racers with the business, right?
True. Yeah. Well, first I got to say, Kip's kind enough to store the cars for me as well, so he's doing that for me. So
I haven't quite sent him the bill.
He hasn't seen the bill yet, so
yeah, just
I knew that was coming. So yeah, if a couple of the cars that are in this building right here, there's a Cobra back here, got a number 15 on it. That is a replica. It's a Shelby built it for Dad for his birthday. What was it? 84th birthday, I think it was. And I had it commissioned, and they made a replica of his 63 Sebring car, which was his favorite Cobra, his favorite ever that he drove. He said for some reason that was the one, a 289 car. I wanted him to drive it, but he was at the point he couldn't even push the clutch in anymore. So we were able to get him in the car, and I drove him around. He actually told me to slow down, which is really weird. I must have been going too fast for him. But yeah, so that's a really neat car. And if you ever seen the cover of the Rip Chords made a song, or the Hey Little Cobra.
Sure.
And Dad's in that car is on the cover of the album for that. And when I gave him the car, it was hidden in my garage, and I had that album, and I had it wrapped and gave it to him. And he undid it, and he took the record out, and he's like, "Oh, this is so cool!" I'm like, "Dad, you're on the cover. You remember?" "Oh yeah." And then I bought a record player, and I put the song on, let it play, and then while it was playing, I went and ran around, got the car, pulled it out of the driveway. It was really special.
Justin, your dad was this big, tall, handsome American, kind of movie star, good looks. One of the guys who in the 50s ended up racing in Europe. And, that's pretty unusual for Americans. Your dad and Phil Hill are two guys that come to mind. They were contemporaries.
Yep.
Do you recall when you realized, your dad was kind of an international superstar in racing?
Sure. So he retired in 1970. I was born in 71. So I really didn't know, right? Until we had a race team. So once I got a little bit older, I'm going to all the races, and yeah, you see all the people. He walks around, and they're like, oh, Dan, and they come up, and they're almost scared to ask for an autograph and stuff. I'm like, wow, he's obviously pretty big time, right?
Yeah.
I got to see him do one professional race because he was obviously retired, but he besides Toyota celebrity races, I saw him do all those. But he did a one-off race at Riverside, 1980 NASCAR race. So he hadn't been in the car for a decade, and he came out of retirement for that. So I was 9. So I got to see that. So then that you really see your dad at Riverside. I mean, it was like a superstar.
Dan Gurney and Riverside were sort of synonymous.
Yeah, I mean, if if you're a driver and you see him on the grid, you're going to have a long day.
My earliest memory of knowing the names of racing drivers, it was Dan Gurney, Parnelli Jones, and I think Richard Petty. Those were the first guys I knew by name. And, they all came up in a really dangerous era in racing. Did your dad ever talk to you about like the danger, the fear? Because he kind of followed Phil Hill into Phil retired relatively early, and so did your dad. Did he ever talk to you about that?
Sure. Yeah, he was already retired, so it was easier for him to talk to me about it. But I asked, of course, and he actually told me that during his time, he actually knew 69 people who lost their lives racing. And I was always blown away that how can you, for instance, if he's at a Formula One race and one of his friends dies in practice, another one dies in qualifying, and you can get in the car and hold it wide open, it just takes a different, person to be able to turn that off.
Right.
But I do think in the end, Jim Clark was the biggest one that affected him, and he was able to keep going. But when Bruce McLaren was killed, and a couple other guys at the end there, that's probably when he said, maybe it's time to, all these younger kids are coming up, I think it's time to get out. I made it, so.
Right. I know that a lot of people thought if this could happen to Jim Clark, who was considered the best driver in the world, then it could happen to me, it could happen to anyone. And I know that was pretty sobering for Jackie Stewart as well, because they were really good friends. Your dad had one bad accident, as I recall. He broke his arm. He rolled the car. Do you remember?
Yeah, I think it was Zandvoort.
Yes.
Yeah, in BRM.
Right.
Yeah, and he didn't really talk about that one that much, except he said he got a big lesson to, he goes, I'm in the car, and the rest of the guys are sitting in the pits. And he, trust those guys to do the car correctly. Now, I'm not saying that someone did something wrong, but he went down, it's a long downhill, maybe a right-hander at the end, and he pushed the brakes, and he said he felt like maybe the brake line expand, and then it broke, popped, and now he's got nothing.
Right.
Yeah, and he went through a fence, over a hill, over another thing, rolled, and unfortunately, someone lost their life.
Right. Yeah, a spectator.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's got to be tough, because he's helpless at that point. He's just kind of along for the ride.
Yeah.
That happened quite frequently in the time.
Yeah.
Kip, what about you? I know that Dan was kind of a hero to you in racing, but do you remember when you first got interested in auto racing and motorsport?
I followed GT racing in the 70s, like when he was racing the Cudas.
Yeah, the Cuda.
That was, for me as a kid, that was the name. Okay, so this Dan Gurney guy, okay, yeah, he seems to be the guy, on the track. And then as I got older, then I recognized more and more. But I'm 56, so Gurney's, his biggest years in racing were in the 60s, and so he was the Rat Pack of the 60s, like we were talking about.
There you go. Yeah.
So trying to get American racing recognized on the world stage, that pack of guys would have been Shelby, Gurney,
Richie Ginther,
Yeah.
Phil Hill. Yeah. These like colorful, kind of brash young Americans, suddenly they're all over Europe. They're racing in Formula One. They're racing in endurance racing. They're at Le Mans. Carroll Shelby sort of, if there was a leader of the Rat Pack with American racers, it would have to be Shell, right? What's more American than a guy in overalls and a cowboy hat going to race in Europe?
Oh yeah, I know that Dad always loved it with regard to Shelby. He loved it because you got these, Southern California hot rodders going up against the establishment, in Europe. He loved that part of it.
I'm glad you said that, Justin, because your dad was a hot rodder in the early 50s. Really, before he was racing, he was into hot rods. Your grandparents relocated from the East Coast, right?
Yeah. So he was born in Port Jefferson in New York, and my grandparents, his parents, decided to move out to Riverside. So you can imagine a kid moving out to Southern California and being into cars. This is like hot rod heaven, right? It was it.
Well, I mean, it was a perfect time period.
Perfect time, right? Yeah, and he hated leaving his friends and stuff, but then he said also, hey, I'm going to Southern California, hot rod place, and that was him. But yeah, if you look back at, he went to Bonneville in 1950 with his buddies. They built a car and went there. He ran 130 miles an hour. It looked pretty ratty, and they drove from Riverside. Said he bought some car for $50, and that was the parts carrier for the car. And then another guy owned the engine, another guy owned the car, and then another guy had a tow vehicle. So it was like just a bunch of his buddies, and they dragged the car out there.
This is like after high school. So where was he working at the time?
He was working at a place called Hunter Engineering out here. And actually he said that's where he learned to, especially in the Cobras, he said all that heat coming out of from the front. Working at that place, he worked in front of a giant furnace, and he goes, I really think that's where I learned to take that heat. That it didn't bother me as much in the car that maybe someone else did.
Oh yeah, because like the footwells in a Cobra are fiberglass, right?
Oh,
so
yeah.
it just bakes you.
Yeah.
Just fries your feet.
I just finished a 1,000-mile rally in my Cobra up in Northern California, and it was last week, and when we had the incredible temperatures down here.
Oh.
And it was, fortunately, it was, once you got to altitude, it was in the mid 60s, low 70s, which was like, whew, because working our way up in 100-degree weather in a Cobra, working your way up to altitude, I thought I was going to die. My shoes, I think I was melting the soles off my shoes, the rubber.
Yeah.
I mean, I've heard stories, I can't remember the details, but I've heard stories about racing drivers basically kind of giving it up because the heat was so intense in the cockpit that like they couldn't hold on, they couldn't keep their feet in the footwells anymore. No insulation.
Yeah, Dad told me that his most difficult race he ever did was a 4-hour Trans Am race at Green Valley, Texas. He was in a Mercury Cougar, and he said that it was in Texas in the middle of summer. So he said it was 112 in the shade outside, and someone had put a bunch of holes in the firewall to cool the motor, and they were just blowing on him.
Oh man!
And he says if you look at the pictures, it's so neat. Parnelli's his teammate, and Parnelli's on his ass the whole race, and Dad actually won by about 3 feet, and he said that was the most difficult thing. He ran out of water like halfway through the race. Said he was screaming in his helmet. He just made it before he passed out. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, just sweating the water loss in the cockpit hour after hour. It's just grueling. I don't think people realize it's not just about the skill and the concentration. It's just being mentally tough to endure the conditions that you're in. Incidentally, I interviewed Terry Cargis from the Peterson Museum not long ago, and one of my favorite stories that he told was he went to Torrey Pines to the road races in the summer of 1955, and he saw your dad in his first race in a Triumph TR2. And he was hooked from then on. Terry remembers that vividly, and he was just a little kid. And he also told me about how your dad, he did the big deal with Toyota, and then when the meeting was concluded, he said, "Now, just tell me one thing. Why do you guys want to lose so bad?" And the Japanese looked at him like, What? What do you mean? And he said, this budget needs to be double at least.
At least, yeah.
There's so much to talk about, Justin.
Right.
I'm just overwhelmed.
There's a ton.
But I mean, your dad knew better than anyone what R&D alone was costing. Like, they didn't test the cars because they didn't have the time or money to test the cars. They just went out and raced them.
Race it, yeah, without ever touching it.
Justin, one of the things your dad is known for is being really versatile as a driver, as an engineer, as a businessman, and that allowed him to transition. Like you say, he retired from his career behind the wheel in 1970, but he had already laid the groundwork years prior to that for, the business. And one of my favorite stories is how he realized that the days of the front engine car at Indy were numbered. And he had seen, obviously, what was going on in Europe with the Coopers. And then when Jack Brabham brought a Cooper to Indy, he realized, this transition isn't just taking place in Formula One. I want to be at the head of the pack on this one.
Yeah, true. And I think he got a little bit of, or a lot of flack from the American guys for pushing that. But he says it was inevitable. It was going to happen. And you see, from Jack coming with the Cooper, and then Dad tried to qualify a turbine car of all things. It had the engine in the back. Dad took his rookie test in a front engine Roadster, John Zink. I think it was called a Track Burner Special. Is a cool name. And then after the rookie test, he got in a John Zink turbine powered car, and he didn't seem to be able to get it up to speed. And he told John Zink, said, "Look, if you need to put someone else in the car, I understand, to see if they can go any faster." So he put someone else in the car. I don't remember exactly who it was, but that guy made it go about a half mile an hour faster, but also couldn't get in the field with it. So he felt okay about that. And that's when he got into Mickey Thompson's car.
Right.
Yeah, and qualified that.
Yeah. And then your dad went to Colin Chapman. He was at Zandvoort, and he went to Colin and he said, "Hey, I would like a Lotus chassis. Ford is ramping up their performance program. We're going to have some really hot engines, and I want to put it in a Lotus chassis." So that partnership, legendary, right? Because that led to Jim Clark going to Indy. I mean, amazing.
Not only that, he also said, "Hey, I've been driving this NASCAR, and these Wood Brothers guys are really good at pit stops. You might want to think about them as well."
Yeah, because the Wood Brothers pretty much invented the modern pit stop, right? Before they kind of regimented the process and cut down on the time, the drivers would get out, they'd go use the restroom, have a smoke.
Yeah. So I mean, if you could do the pit stop faster, it's got a lot of time gained on the track. So he had seen it with the Wood Brothers. Said, these guys know what they're doing.
Yeah.
You might want to think about that too. So they did. Yeah.
And that's another thing is your dad could drive anything. He drove sedans, he drove sports cars, open wheel, a little bit of everything, really versatile.
Yeah, he always told me, he goes, I felt I was very fast and everything, and I wanted to put myself in the best series against the best guys to see how I could do. So that's exactly what he did. Yeah, and in fact, he did it, a lot of times he did that all in the same year, which is unheard of, right? Driving Formula One car, Indy car, NASCAR, sports car, everything all in the same year against the best guys. So, and I know a lot of people ask him, was NASCAR was easy and Formula One was hard. And he goes, no. They were equally as difficult when you're up against the best guys in the series. It's just as difficult as that.
And in fact, he was the first driver to win in all four majors, right? Grand Prix, NASCAR, sports car, and IndyCar.
True.
Yeah.
And only two other guys have done it since. Mario and Montoya.
Montoya, right?
Montoya and Mario, the only two others, Yeah,
amazing. Yeah. And some of the things that your dad did aren't ever going to be repeated just because times have changed and racing is so different. And so, yeah. Now, let's talk about the Shelby connection because we've got a lot of Shelby cars here today, and I want to talk about individual cars as well. But Justin, how did your dad and Shell get hooked up? What was the beginning of their relationship?
The big thing that got All American Racers started was actually a tie-in through Carroll, and I guess it was the morning of the Indy 500, maybe 64, I want to say. On the morning of the 500, everybody switched to Firestones, and Goodyear's standing out there with no tires on any car, and they're like, we can't have this. This is really bad. So they went to Carroll and they said, would you, if we paid you, of course, would you build cars that strictly run on Goodyear's? And Carroll said, I'm busy with these and Cobra and GT and da-da-da. He goes, I'm too busy. But you should ask Dan. Maybe he would like to do that. So they did, and Dad said, yeah, I'm into that, on one condition, that you let us go Formula One racing. So they agreed. So really, Carroll helped us start All American Racers. In fact, he was half owner up to like 1970.
And the reason everyone switched to Firestones was, the way I understand it, is that Goodyear was really trying to break into the racing market, and they'd convinced a lot of teams to run their tires, but at the end of the day, this is the 500, they didn't really trust these tires. They were kind of a new thing. The Firestones were a known quantity. Is that how you understand it?
Yeah, and probably at that point the Firestones were a little faster. So.
Right, sure. Yeah,
you
want the edge, right?
Yeah.
And the concept behind All American Racers was, this is going to be an American operation. The development, the chassis, the engine, the drivers. He had already been to Europe and worked for Ferrari and Porsche. He knew how the Europeans did things.
Yeah, I mean, Dad was All-American guy, right? So he thought that he could beat the Europeans on any track, anywhere, and hired a bunch of SoCal hot rodder guys that could do it, and showed him he could. And the first car we ever built was an Indy car, and it went to 66 Indy 500, and unfortunately didn't even make it to turn one. After all that, you imagine all that hard work, and you get the car done, you're finally there, and didn't even make it to turn one. Someone crashed in front of him. If you watch the video, he almost makes it out through all these people, and someone just cleans off like both right side tires. It was that.
All that work.
Yeah.
But your dad had a sense of humor about things, which I think can sustain you, especially if you don't take yourself too seriously.
Yeah, very true. He was so good at that, and calming down a situation, or especially with the team, to bring the team together and lift everybody up after something like that. And I saw it hundreds of times. He'd do stuff like that, and one incident always makes me just laugh so hard. And it was later. It was in the kart years in like 96, and we were sponsored by Toyota, and we were having a lot of difficulty with engines at the time, blowing up a lot of engines all the time, over and over and over. And someone from Toyota came to AAR and in front of the whole company and gave a big speech before the season started, 96, and said, hey, we don't want to dominate. We had just dominated GTP and IMSA. We had really done very well. We won the last 23 out of 26 races, so we were good. And now we're coming in a kart. So this guy says, we don't want to dominate. And everyone's looking at each other like, yeah, we do. What does that mean? It was a strange thing. No one liked hearing that. So we're at Laguna Seca, 96 IndyCar race. We qualified dead last, way off the pace, slow as hell. Juan Fangio, the second's driving the car. They fire up the car and they push it from the back, the electric starter, fire it up, and the engine blows. Gentlemen, start your engines. It blew up. And everyone's like, oh my God. And then I remember Dad got on the radio, and everyone's listening to the team. He goes, Juan Foncho drive, Juan, I don't want you to dominate. Everybody, just laughing like crazy. It was so good.
Right.
So good.
I mean, that's leadership, right? Because everybody probably had the same awful feeling at that moment. And then for your dad to lighten the mood like that, it kind of lets everybody off the hook in a way,
Yeah. I mean, he was the ultimate racer like that. I mean, he could do that. And then other times, like I remember at Daytona 24, like 83, something like that. We were in Toyota again. We were in a GTU, and the engine blew up. And Dad goes, the 24-hour race. Dad goes, let's rebuild the motor. And they're like, well, why? We're out of the race. We're not going to win. And he's like, yeah, but we got 24 hours. That's a good time to test. We get to be testing the whole time. So they rebuilt the motor, went out for hours and hours and hours driving it, and it blew up again. And he said, we got plenty of time. Let's rebuild it again. He said it was almost a mutiny in the thing. But if they didn't know already, Dad was a racer, and they followed him. They would follow him off a cliff,
Yeah. Not to mention, pushing your team like that, you find if you don't push your team, you don't know where the limits are. That's not just true in racing. It's true in a lot of endeavors in life, I think.
I was curious, where does it, in his engineering and his mechanical side, did it start really young, and did he just pick it up along the way? Because he was a master in mechanics.
Yeah. He was all, from when he was a kid. He said when he's, in school and listening to the teacher, all he was thinking about was, I'm going to build a rocket or go home and work on my cars or whatever. So it was from early age. Yeah, he was more into making stuff.
How about you?
Same.
Yeah.
Same. Yeah.
Kip, I want to hear more about this Cobra tour you just did.
There's a gentleman up in Northern California. His name's Drew Serb. He has a museum up there called the Cobra Experience. And, he's one of the true underground guys that do the Cobras today. That he is the main man, and he flies below the radar. But you'll have a lot of the main Cobra people that are into the Cobras, and as soon as you say his name, it's like, okay, yeah, he's definitely the top of the, if not one of the top of the food chains. And if you go up to his facility, he has all Carroll's original bucks and tools, and he's still restoring cars today. And anyway, he puts on this tour. It's called the Cobra 1000, and done by the Cobra Experience Center, which is his. And they do 1,000 miles. This year was my first year. I was fortunate enough to be invited to go on it. We started in Martinez, California, and then we went up around Tahoe, and then up to Mount Shasta, and then back down through the Sierras. And it was 1,000 miles, fantastic 1,000 miles of driving, and it was all pure. You can't get on unless it's a real Cobra. And we had everything from big blocks, narrow bodies, small blocks, just there all sorts of variety of real original Cobras, and it was a good time.
That's awesome. How many cars?
20.
20. Mm-hmm. He wants to keep it small like that, right?
Yes.
I mean, that's pretty small.
He's a simple guy, right. When it comes to stuff, and he wants everyone to have a good time, and 20 cars, you're talking 40 people plus support. That's a handful, because when you're on these rallies and you have to stop and 40 people have to eat, the little local diner in the small town is not going to take on 40 people instantly and feed you. So it's a lot of work. You got to find hotels that I can get 20 rooms in these hotels and dinners. The bigger you become, more commercialized when the rallies get bigger. So if you have a smaller rally, you can control it, you can make it better, you can enhance it for the participants.
Oh, for sure. For sure. I'm interested to hear your observations about driving Cobras, whether it's a 289 or a 427. I mean, I've never driven a Cobra. I've ridden in a Cobra before, and that's an amazing experience. But what's it like behind the wheel for Describe it for people.
Well, you've got a ton of horsepower with no weight. I'm familiar with a small block Cobra. My Cobra is a small block. I don't have the experience with a big block. You might.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
But a small block Cobra is fantastic because the handling is unbelievable. They don't push in the turns. You can confidently power into turns and power through the turns. They're a little rougher riding, I think, compared to a big block, but then it sure makes up for the with the handling. We had a fantastic time, and I enjoy driving mine. It's a fun car, and I've driven some of the continuation cars, and I think that you can get a continuation car and a replica car that rides much nicer, might offer you a lot more, but you have to remember it's not the real thing. And when you're behind the wheel, the real thing, it's a life-changing experience.
I mean, it's pretty amazing how much they got out of a transverse front leaf spring and a live rear axle. I mean,
it's like buggy.
Yeah,
it's a buggy.
You're in you think about it, your 40s technology in the front, late 40s, right? On the front end of that car.
Yeah.
Well, back even farther. I mean, my Model A Ford has a transverse front leaf spring, transverse front and rear.
Dad always told me that he loved the 289 the most. I mean, he raced both. He said the 427 is obviously great. I like it, like on the Mulsanne, for instance. But besides that, it's heavy, use up too much brakes. Like I was saying, that Sebring car, that was his favorite one, said it handled the best. Yeah.
How do you like driving them?
Oh, man. Besides it being hot in there and loud, that probably makes it even more awesome. I mean, I love driving it. It's like one of the only cars that obviously everything's manual. There's no fancy anything inside of it. Just raw, open. And one of the only cars that I've seen where, it's just, there's no muffler on mine. It's just a straight pipe thing where you could almost get away with it. They say, oh, well, that's a Cobra, so don't worry about it. And people, and everywhere you go, I mean, you Kip could tell you, everyone thumbs up everywhere you go. People just, it's like one of those things that people just love it.
Yeah.
With the small block, the 289 motor, when I was younger, I was more of a GM guy, and I'd go for the small block GMs and then into the big blocks. I actually started big blocks then when the stroker small blocks were more interesting. But having a 289 and experiencing rallies on a 289, this 65 sitting behind us, this GT350, when you get used to hearing that 289, it is a sound on its own, and they buzz. And they don't sound right when they're just purring. When those things when you're on it, you hear that thing working and buzzing, and if it's not doing 3,500 to 4,000 RPMs, it doesn't sound right. Of all the motors I've fallen in love with, the 289 is actually one of my favorite motors now. And you have cars like this Sunbeam Tiger with the 289 in it also, and it's to have multiple cars with the same motor. You're hearing that engine, and it's you obtain a love for it.
Yeah, Kip, I think you were telling me the Tiger is like a Cobra, but it's comfortable.
It is. I think it's the weight. It's so much heavier than a Cobra. It has more suspension give, so it's a more comfortable car to drive than the Cobra. It has a pretty equal amount of pull, but it could be the gearing because the tires are smaller on the Tiger, so it gets off the line a lot quicker. I think on the big end, it'd be a different thing, But
plus it's got roll-up windows. It's got a fully trimmed interior, and
definitely more room. I found that on the Cobra, on a long drive, you have to kick your shoes off. You can't even run racing shoes. You got to kick your shoes off, and because you got to. For me, I take my pedal foot and I put it underneath the pedal and I stretch it out for a second and I hold it with my left foot for a little while just to give it a break because I feel like you're up and there was just not a lot of room in those cars.
Yeah, I moved on ours. I took the seat and moved it all the way against the the rear wall there, and I took all the padding out of the seat too, just to give me that couple inches. It makes a big difference.
Well, you're what, 6'4"?
Maybe 6'3", 6'2", and some change.
Your dad was obviously a tall guy
Very
too.
Yeah.
And I mean, we got to talk about the Gurney Bubble, right?
Sure.
The elephant in the room?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
I always wondered how your dad could spend hours in these cars. You know, especially the European cars, they're small no matter what, no matter who you are. The American cars, a little bit more room in a NASCAR, for example. But tell the story about the Gurney Bubble.
Sure. I mean, first, if you look at a lot of when he's in the open wheel stuff, almost always the roll bar was below his head. So it didn't do a heck of a lot. There was no rule at the time. You had to have a roll bar. It didn't say how big, or, you know, but most time below his head. So yeah, in the Ford, in the GT, he said when he first got in it, you know, he got in and his head is like this when you close the door. So that obviously wasn't going to work. He actually took the seat out, and if there was anything below the seat, he took it all away, even shaved down whatever it could. So he got the seat as low as he could, and still his head stuck out. So Phil Remington actually built the first bubble for him on there. So he said, well, in order for him to fit, cut out a chunk of the roof and put a bubble over where his helmet would be. So yeah, if you look on a lot of those cars, it has they refer to it as the Gurney Bubble. When my mom got him the 05 Ford GT over here for his birthday, like I think his 75th birthday, she bought it for him. Ford installed the Gurney Bubble on that 05 for him. So that's the only one, the only 05 or newer GT with the bubble in it. Other people might have done it, but it's the only real one. Yeah.
Custom made for Dan. Yeah.
It's pretty neat.
It's awesome.
You say custom? Ford made it.
Yeah.
They just made one.
Yeah. And another Gurney innovation is the Gurney Flap.
Yeah.
And that's kind of it's a simple device, but it was a game changer. It was good for like 10 or 12 miles an hour, right?
Unbelievable, even more.
Okay, so tell us about that.
So 1971, McLaren came to Indy with a new car, and they put 13 miles an hour on top of the 1970 time, which was, a massive number. Usually, it's 1 or half a mile an hour, right? 13. And Dad was like, oh goodness, we're in big trouble. And they qualified first and second. It was Penske McLaren's first and second. We qualified third with our car. But they were 13 miles an hour faster than the year before. So we're out testing after Indy at, I think, Phoenix. And we're there most of the day, and Bobby Unser's our driver, and he could be very outspoken. And he said to Dad, he goes, Dan, you're supposed to know all these things. Can't you come up with something that could, we're not going any faster. And then Dad, he said, I was already thinking about it. He said, actually on the Ford GT, on the Mark IV at Le Mans, he goes, we fiddled with the it didn't have a wing, but it had a spoiler on the back. And he goes, we fiddled with that spoiler all the time, and it made a giant difference on the Mulsanne, just an 1/8 of an inch. He goes, I could feel it. It was a huge difference. So he goes, what if we put a little spoiler on the wing? And he went out and actually did it himself. He said he got a piece of aluminum, and he goes, I bent it up, and I told the guys, let's do this. So he drilled some holes and stuck it on the rear wing of our 1971 car. Sent Bobby out. Bobby did 1 lap, and he came in and he said, oh, this thing's awful. It doesn't steer anymore. It's horrible. Something's. What do you guys do? And Dad said, holy. So he goes, put some of those on the front wings. Bobby went around, pulled in, and everyone's looking at their stopwatch like, oh my God. And he goes, Dan, I think whatever you just did is the biggest advantage that anyone's had in the last 50 years. And he said, is anybody watching right now in the stands? You know, because a lot of times they would go and watch other teams. And Dad looked around and said, no one's here. He said, we need to pack up and get out of here. Yeah, so that flap was that big of a difference. And it's a tiny little thing.
It's like a 90-degree bend in a piece of like
he said
stock
usually
aluminum.
he said usually you make it 1%. The magic number was 1% of the cord length of the wing. 1%, a little tiny little piece of aluminum. It helped the air stay attached longer.
Right.
Right. So it made, in essence, a bigger wing.
Right.
We took it to Indy 1972 for the first time, and McLaren has their new cars, and here's our new Eagle, first time with the Gurney Flap. We got the pole position, and we put 17 miles an hour on top of the 13 from the year before. Still the biggest gain ever until today, right? Still the biggest. So over from 1970 to 72, it went up like 30 miles an hour.
And isn't that when you guys broke the 200-mile-an-hour barrier at Indy that year?
So Indy, we were still doing like 195, 197. So Ontario, 72, we took it, and no Indy car had ever gone 200 average. First ever 200-mile-per-hour lap.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we actually went 201 the next day. Bobby went 201. Bobby was always pissed that he didn't get the first 200-mile-per-hour lap. And maybe he would have, but I think there was some kind of engine problem. So Jerry got it, yeah.
Wow. Justin, I'm interested to hear about your dad winning Le Mans in '67 with A.J. Foyt. A.J. was a rookie. Your dad was a seasoned veteran at that point, and he kind of took A.J. under his wing.
Oh, yeah. Well, 67 would have been his 10th try to win. And he had won before in the GT class in the Cobra Daytona. But for overall, this would have been his 10th try. And he said he'd always seen Briggs Cunningham would always kick his butt. And he goes, I was going much faster, but Briggs wasn't using up the car. And apparently I was. So getting AJ was great. Dad loved AJ and knew he was a big talent. And they got along famously. And the word was that they were going to be the rabbit, and go out and make everyone break. And Dad was like, nah, we're gonna win this thing. We're not going to be the rabbit. So he said, never did I try to, he wanted to, him against AJ. Of course, Dad, being the racer, he wants to be the fastest always. But he said, AJ, look, I've done this 9 times. This is an endurance contest. This is what this is at this point. And we need to do the race this way. We stick to this, we're going to be at the front. So let's not have an inter-team, rivalry. This is what we're going to do. And AJ said, okay. And he was a rookie, never been there before. And I think they qualified a little bit back, 8th or something like that. And Ford guy said, well, what's wrong? Why are we? And Dad said, look, the car's perfect. Don't touch it. It's fine. And he said that he worked with AJ. He said, look, at the end of Mulsanne, however long Mulsanne was, 3-point-something miles straight away, right? With a right turn at the end. So he said, you're on the brakes for a long time, every lap. And he goes, let's not use up the brakes. We'll just lift way early, use the engine to slow us down, then apply the brakes. So they worked on that, and it worked. There's tons of stories in that race that happened, which are great. Apparently, Enzo had told, I think it was Mike Parks in the Ferrari, you get behind Dan and you make him make a mistake because he's going to want to race you and you need to make him make a mistake. So Dad said that the Mark IV, the Ford would go about 213-ish on Mulsanne. And he goes, the Ferrari, even in my draft, would do about 209. So he goes, at any point, I could stretch it out, even if he was in the draft. It would drive away from him. And in the middle of the night, so the Ferrari's behind him, and he's right on his ass, and he's flicking the high beams and doing all this funny stuff. And Dad pulled over and tried to let him by. No, he'd stay behind. And he said that happened for a couple laps. And at one point he said, forget this. So at Arnage, that corner, Dad pulled off and stopped while leading the race. And the Ferrari pulled off and stopped also behind him. So now first and second place, sitting on the side of the road in the grass. He's leading, the Ferrari's in second. And Dad said he's just sitting there waiting for Mike Parks to drive away. And he said he flicked the lights a couple times, And he said, he goes, I waited there for a while, and finally Parks pulled off and took off. And someone made a painting of it. It's a great story.
That's an amazing story.
Yeah, it's really good. And then Dad said, after a while I went and passed him, and he and AJ won. And then AJ famously said, he goes, why would I want to go back? I already won it, I was a rookie, went there and won. And that's a famous 3 weeks. AJ won the Indy 500. Actually, Dad was on the front row and led Indy 500 too, in the Eagle. Then they went to Le Mans and they won that. And then the week later, Dad went to Spa, Belgian Grand Prix, and won that in the Eagle. So that's pretty amazing. That's 3 weeks. Yeah, that's unbelievable.
I mean, wow.
Yeah, right? Perfect. The stars aligned, right?
And your dad started a motorsport tradition at Le Mans in '67 on the podium.
Yeah, true. It's his 10th time there, and he finally won it. And he goes, I just wanted to do something. Something just came over me, and I was so, he used the word stoked, Southern California thing. He said, I was so stoked. I grabbed that bottle.
Of champagne.
Big Moet bottle. And he said, Henry Ford II and his wife and all the photographers sitting there. And he said, I just started spraying it and just dousing everybody. And then he took that bottle after spraying it and handed it to a guy named Flip Schulke, who was a Life magazine photographer. Not knowing that he had started something or anything, handed it to him and then got whisked off to whatever, other victory things. And that guy, that Flip, held on to that bottle his entire life. He actually made a lamp out of it at his house, had a lampshade, drilled a hole in the bottom of it, stuck the thing through, and later, Flip, I think came down with cancer or something, and he said, Dan, I really want you to have this back. Wow. So we still have it to this day. We've made a little commemorative bottle since. Actually, AJ's winery made the bottle and the champagne that's in it. It's actually, I see one right there, Kip.
Yeah, I'm looking for it.
Kip one. I see it right in the middle of your deal there. Yeah.
Yeah, it's right there.
So it's kind of neat.
It's so neat. And it's not just a motorsport tradition. It's really any sporting event.
Yeah.
The victory spray with the champagne.
Yeah, isn't that crazy? So they do it at every sporting event. So he was the first guy at any sporting event. Hadn't happened before. Yeah, here's the bottle right there. And you could see. So this is the AJ Foyt winery that did this, and it tells a little story here on how they did it. And then there's the picture of Dad spraying it that day. It's pretty
terrific,
pretty neat. Yeah. So you could spray this.
Was the beginning
real quick? Yeah.
Yeah, we can open it right now if you want.
Yeah.
How many bottles were produced? Do you know?
I don't think very many.
Maybe a few cases or something.
Yeah, like 10 cases. Yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't know that. There's only a couple of cases of this.
Yeah.
And I'm honored to have one. I'll make sure I don't open it.
Don't save it.